Today we have a talk between Bryan O'Doherty and Layman Pascal. Bryan runs a blog called Broadaland and writes frequently about integral economics and integral politics, especially the possibilities of an integral panarchy. In this talk, Bryan and Layman will review his integral stage model of economics and will extend some boldly cautious and brashly sneaky feelers into the bubbling matrix of the messianically hovering integral culture to come. So Bryan and Layman, if you'd like to begin, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, Bryan.
Hey, how's it going?
Great. This is cool. In my head, what I imagine is we just go through the stages one after another.
Okay.
You lay out sort of the way your take is, your model, that kind of thing, and then we just bounce back and forth some ideas at each of those phases. We do 5 or 10 minutes per stage. That's an hour, hour and a half, something like that. We'll see how it goes. Maybe we'll both get some neat ideas.
Okay, cool. Should I just briefly describe the model that I?
Yeah. Start with a little overview. That would be great.
Okay, so what I was trying to do was come up with a 4-quadrant economic model, and so when I was looking at sort of how economics has kind of been developed, you know, in the standard the standard way they teach economics, they have sort of the positive and the normative, which that distinction was kind of made by Milton Friedman and Keynes back in the 50s. But it's basically, you know, your normative are the what oughts. They're talking about, you know, what ought to be, and they're looking at economics through a lens of describing the way they want the world to work, and then trying to change society so that it fits that mold. And then you have the positivists who more they take a look and they try to make economics almost like a physical science. They're just looking at data, they're analyzing that data, and then they're coming to conclusions based on that analysis. And so further on, like the neoliberal evolution of that was to try and take the normative and the positive and synthesize those into what they considered a full idea of what economics should be. And what that really was it was just saying, okay, we're gonna talk about the oughts. We're gonna say, okay, the world ought to be this way, and then we're gonna do some things, change some policies, and we're gonna study what happens, and then we're just gonna kind of adjust things and go back and forth. And so that's where you get sort of politics coming into economics, you know, trying to change policies to make certain economic realities come to fruition. That either works or it doesn't work, and then they go back to the drawing board and so on and so forth. And so what I was trying to say is that in order to really understand economics, you have to have, you know, you can't just have the we and its spaces. You have to talk about the I and the it spaces. You have to talk about sort of the individual micro level of economics. And that's really where praxeology comes into, is important, because praxeology talks about human action. It talks about, you know, what we do and why we do it. So you know, the internal, my will. So I have I want something, I value something, and so that creates in me a desire for that, and then out of that desire I take action, and I go out into the world and I do something to gain whatever it is that I'm trying to gain out in the world. So there's sort of that interior I space, and there's that exterior it space. The will on the one hand, and the action that I take on the other. And then, of course, the whole 7 billion people doing that in the world then creates the lower, you know, we and its spaces, right? So so that's sort of the gist of it. Is just you know, it was actually you know, it came out of a discussion in Herpes, right, about economics and a confusion about, okay, so, you know, people didn't even know what praxeology is because no one talks about it. So that's kind of where it started. And then I wrote that essay and started going through the phases, and we can run into the phases unless you have something you want to.
Well, I just say that what I like about your approach is it seems extremely straightforward. I mean, if you start with the modern synthesis and you just make sure that's 4-quadrant and run it through the stages, it's almost like that's a very moderate move, I think. There's other people do it different ways. Like I like Kevin Bowman's integral economic model, and he does some very strange things where he's going to make the left-hand quadrants be things that are internalities to the economy and the right-hand quadrant be externalities. There's a lot of strange ways to do it. Your way seems to be extremely straightforward, which I think is a virtue.
Yeah, and thank you. And I mean, it was kind of like one of those things where I'd thought a lot about integral politics, and you know how politics is sort of politics is, I like to say, it's philosophy in action, right? It's where you take philosophy is very internal. We talk about it, we think about it, we discuss it, and then politics is taking that and saying, okay, now we're going to do it, you know, in the world. And economics to me is kind of psychology in action. It's our because everyone's values are different and everyone wants different things. You know, what makes economics work in the real world is, you know, when I say, you know, I value this pen to a certain degree, right? And you value it to a certain degree, and those two degrees are different. And so when you say, I want that, you know, I want that pen, I'll pay you $1 for it. And I'm like, well, shit, I'd rather have $1 than this pen. So I give you the pen, you give me the $1, and we're both better off. And that's like the meat of praxeology. It's the subjective theory of value versus some other theories of value that are out there, like the labor theory of value and so on.
There's a real, I always appreciate the poetry that's involved in pricing. Even though you like run your mind back to primitive barter exchanges, even though it turns out, I think, that the use of money goes back much farther than we originally thought. But still, there's this idea of how are we going to abstract a transaction from two different substances? And it's really an intuitive process, right? Like how many chickens is a cow? It's not obvious what the answer is. It involves you feeling things out and the other person feeling things out and trying to weigh those things in yourself and concretize that somehow. I think it's much more interesting, intuitive, artistic, poetic than most people give it credit for. I know a lot of people get turned off by economics, but it's fascinating, the exchanges and the dimensions. And like you say, if economics is psychology in action, and psychology's complexity is indefinitely scalable, then there's a huge amount of richness there, right? If we start throwing in the unconscious mind, or you're like, well, how do we factor that in? We just don't know. There's a huge amount of room to investigate, I think. So why don't you start us off at beige?
Yeah, so I kind of went through each stage, and so I asked sort of the question, okay, at each stage, what is it that I will, what do I do, what ought to be, and what is. And, you know, at beige, it's just pure survival. It's like survival economics. You know, you're really just after food and warmth and safety and just sort of those basic things, right? That's what you value. That's what you want. And so how do you get those when you have nothing? Well, you hunt, you forage, you make tools, so on and so forth. And that was kind of humanity for thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. And the environment, the what is it's just a harsh environment. It's you against Mother Nature. And actually, you're not even separate from Mother Nature. It's all, you know, you're like the baby right out of the womb, psychologically speaking, you know. So, and really it's just about surviving to the next winter. So all your entire goals, the ought, so to speak, is just that survival. And that really drives everything. And so, I think at that stage, we're talking about small bands of people, hunter gatherers, no real economy like we would think of an economy, right? It's just you're just trying to feed yourself, you're trying to feed your children, you're trying to feed your kin group, and that's it, and clothe and shelter, and that's it, really. So I mean that's the basis level of beige, right?
Kind of a caloric economy.
Yeah, exactly.
I find for me, beige is the hardest one to wrap my head around. Like, I feel like it's so removed from me in time, and that my experiences of it personally and socially are of a decadent, a broken down version of it. If I try to imagine beige, I think of homeless people, beggars, zombies. I think of myself, drunk or concussed or something like that, just grabbing things. And so, but that's not a really good version of what was healthy about beige that lasted for 100,000 years. When I see a woman on the street and she's unkempt and she's wearing the same hoodie she wears every day, it's hard for me to really imagine how she's connected to this other woman who wears the same bearskin every day, but has tremendous skills in the world that she's embedded in. I feel like I really have a very weak grasp of what the living beige economy actually is, if we're even going to call it an economy. But I feel like that's the one that I have the most difficulty envisioning.
Right. Well, it's interesting what you said there, because I think that is where it shows up in modern society, is really in homeless, community, the homeless community, mental illness, where because you got to think like the psychology of someone who is at beige is just so undeveloped that I mean, you really can't map too much sophistication on what's going on in that interior.
It's very hard for me to gauge it. Like, part of me sees primate bands.
Yeah, I mean,
I see how rich they are potentially, and that what I expect is that throughout my entire life, we're going to keep discovering things that makes us aware of how much more sophisticated they are than we used to think. But at the same time, there's a definite limit there. And to me, beige is very similar. I want to do justice to the sophistication of perhaps the longest running phase of human civilization. So they had something, and it's got to be better than the examples of it that I see in my own life. But at the same time, those are the examples I see. That's how it persists in our current system.
Right. Like you might say that a troop of bonobo chimpanzees, for example, is as beige as it gets, and they trade with each other, right?
Yeah.
Sex for food.
Yeah, not everybody's making those obsidian knives.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and I also like the example you said. You were talking about the value of a chicken or whatever, and it's like, well, what is the value of a chicken if you all you have is chickens, versus a cow, right? And the neighboring group has a cow, and you have all chickens. Well, the guy with the cow may really want to have chickens more than you do because you just have a ton of them, right? So it's that subjective value. But anyway, back at this level, at this stage of development, I think at beige, again, there's no value is really just about what helps me survive, what helps my genes survive. So that would be my offspring, right? And that's pretty much it. I mean, there's not a whole lot more going on. And so, we're talking about crafting tools, that helps, right? Spears and arrows and all that kind of stuff. And then that starts to build and prepare for the next stage. Because you're starting to build specialization into the group.
Sure. Well, let's go into that next stage. What's your, how do you see those normativities and positivities at purple?
The next stage I call magical economics. And at this stage, the world is this is where they all say the world is teeming with magic and spirits, and they've got to be appeased, and you start seeing deities, even gods, so to speak, tribal gods. But you still don't have, there's still not an ego, there's still not a self really that's apart from the tribe. The tribe is sort of everything. So the economics, the way I see the economics of Purple is that they center around that communion with the spirits and tribes, and so there's really a lot less sort of this idea. The idea of private property really hasn't even come up yet, and so and everything is sort of centered around just furthering the community and appeasing the gods, essentially. So when I went through sort of what I will, what I do, what is, and what ought to be, what I will is like, just it's about the continued survival of your tribe. It's about appeasing gods and spirits and making sure that they favor the tribe. So you're praying for healing, you're dancing for rain, you're making offerings. A lot of the transactions that happen at that stage are transactions between you and the other world, or between your tribe and the other world. Human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, all of these things are sort of in that context. The what is a world just full of magic and gods and power that's beyond your control, and the personification of Mother Nature as spirits and so on, and then you have neighboring tribes who will either trade with you or make war on you, and it's a very harsh, dangerous environment. But it is the environment where you start to see trade and you start to see some specialization. So you and in order for your tribe to thrive, like I was saying earlier, one tribe might be a goat herding tribe, or the next tribe is a fishing tribe, and so on. And so these tribes might trade with each other. And gosh, the tribe that has a ton of fish is just really wants some goat milk, and so these different tribes might trade with each other.
That's partly a function of their mental idea of what their region has expanded.
Yeah.
So these other tribes are in their game board now where they weren't before.
Right.
Sometimes I think of beige or infrared or whatever as the view from deep in the woods, and purple as the view from the campsite. And then so everybody's around the fire. You've got this different realm. Now you could pass out of that back into the dark woods at any moment, and people do. They go out and they come back, but they come back. And once they're back, it's like the fire tenders have a protocol for distributing the resources that have been gathered. They have, to me, one of the key innovations at this level to me are lore and elders. And these people really stabilize an intergenerational set of rules about what we do with the resources that we hunt and gather. And I think that beige probably doesn't have much in the way of protocols for that. So now there's a gathering, and then there's a distributing.
Absolutely, yeah. I would see beige as more. Beige is more. I don't want to say like red in the aspect, but it kind of is, because you can imagine like in a kinship group, the strongest eat first, and then the mothers have to fight to get the food for their children and all that kind of stuff. All those things happening, and it might be more or less peaceful than that or whatever, but it's more raw, I would think, or more you see something you want and you just grab it, like reflexively.
Direct and simplistic.
Yeah, exactly. And then at purple, you're more there's a lot more structure to that. There's a tribal hierarchy. And there's a distribution of goods, because you really don't find tribes where you have, like I was saying, personal property yet. Everything is essentially communally owned.
So what I will under those conditions in your system is essentially the good of the group is what I will, rather than myself.
Because you identify with the tribe, so there's no singular I as yet. I mean, there was I can't even remember who wrote it, but there was a really great paper about when people started to really have a sort of sense of individuality, and it wasn't that long ago. I mean, it was almost like until very recently in human history, most people around the world had almost no sense of themselves as distinct individuals.
Yeah, Julian Jaynes argues that it was just a few thousand years ago.
Yeah.
Because even in the Odyssey and the Iliad, there's no sense of an individual being motivated by their own thoughts or drives.
Right. And so that's the psychology that we're talking about here is sort of that level. But then you get into the next phase where that really starts to come out.
Yeah, that next leap to me is fascinating, because there's such a tremendous diversification and explosion of complexity at Red that we often don't think of, because they're easy to dismiss as barbaric, but barbarian culture is extremely rich. When you introduce individual control over objects, and that the distribution of the gathered resources is no longer determined just by the repetition of the lore of the tribe, but is now negotiable within the fluctuating status hierarchy. So that's a tremendously more complex and more variable system is in play then.
Yeah. And
why don't you run us through your 4 for Red?
Yeah, so Red, to me, Red gets a lot of it's like almost like the it's the redheaded stepchild of it, right? I mean, everyone's always, he's just red,
Everybody has somebody in their family they'd like to dismiss as red.
Exactly. But I love red. I mean, red is, to me, I think red is, it's like you were saying, it's colorful, it's beautiful, it's powerful. It's there's just a lot of to use a Jeff Salzman phrase, juice in red. I think it's great. But it does have this sort of dark side, which is that it's sort of the might makes right mentality. But from an economic standpoint, what I will is, it's about me now. It's about achieving power, riches, renown, and riches, not in the way, not for the reason that modern people would think of accumulating riches, right? Riches for someone at Red is not about personal wealth. It's about increasing renown and increasing reputation, and being able to display that power, and also being able to hand out that power to potential followers, and increase one's own sort of power by creating underneath you a repertoire of other fighters.
There's an interesting transition there, because one of the things I picked up on when you were talking about purple was the degree to which the dream world is a factor in their economics.
Yeah, right.
And then at Red, it's like that's solidified a little bit, and the quality of being legendary, it takes over from the dream quality, and that's something that an individual can possess. Right? Like your reputation is almost an aspect of the dream world that you personally have control over. Just like you now personally have some property, you have your own hut and stuff. So now I own some of the dream world, which is my reputation, the way I appear in the subliminal mind of others, the way I'm depicted on the totem, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think for red especially, it's about how do I as an individual become one with that dream world, because you've kind of separated yourself from it when you've left purple, and so now you're like, I want to be a god, right? And so how do you do that? Well, you prove yourself, you gain prowess, you gain following, you gain legend. Stories are told about you, and legend, all of that stuff is so important to red, and so the economics all center around that. I mean, it's all about that.
So what is it that they do then?
So what they do is they they focus on skills that will increase their prestige and their prowess and their reputation, and that could mean that they farm, they trade, but you start seeing raiding, plundering, taking slaves. All of these things start to really become a large part of red societies, and you're trying to gain, and you're doing all of this activity to gain recognition from your peers, to gain recognition maybe from your chief, and to gain recognition from the gods, so that in a lot of these religions that come around during this period, you can't even be in the same room with the gods unless you demonstrate that you're worthy of that, right? Through this sort of activity. And this is where like burial goods come into play, and stuff like that, where you're buried with all your treasures and your
Right.
slaves and your animals and all this kind of stuff.
They're mine now.
Yeah. So that's sort of what you want to do, and it's in a world where everyone's vying for dominance. You've got political like Machiavellian political maneuverings. You've got sorcery. So there's still magic in there, right? And so it's just, yeah, that's basically the biggest point to remember about red in this period, and sort of the economic thinking, is that all of the gold and metal and precious stones and objects and all of these things do not have worth except to further that goal. You're not trying to buy the next iPad or whatever, unless that iPad somehow proves that you are superior in some way. And so, in today's culture, you would see that in sort of the maybe the gang cultures, or the bling bling kind of, I'm going to display my wealth and flaunt it, and put gold in my mouth and all that stuff.
Yeah.
That comes out as wealth in those times it's portable, it's wearable, I can easily pass it on, and that shows up today as well in that psychology.
I think it's easy for more sophisticated people to get a simplistic idea of the barbarian culture.
Yeah.
Like as if it was just an exaggeration of our basest egotism. I think it's not like everybody wants to be at the top of the pyramid all the time. There's an instinct in everyone to be somewhere in that system, but they're fluctuating. You struggle and compete to find your spot in the distribution of the resources. So the gang or the tribe, I think of it as a seizure-based economy. They seize things, right? You go to the next tribe, you grab some stuff. They even have early forms of domestication of animals. You see a cow you like, you seize it. And then how do you distribute what you've seized? You have a protocol whereby rank is essentially the degree to which you can decide about the distribution of the captured resources. And then your rank has to be decided. So your rank is decided by something like legend, something like emotional intensity. I know when I read your site, it's got that great quote from the original Conan.
Yeah.
Fantastic movie, the first one. Second one, not so good. But I think it's easy to use the male warrior a little bit too much as the epitome of red, in the sense that, you know, there's lots of different ways to acquire that emotional intensity in the eyes of your tribe.
Sure.
The warriors can bring something home and they're feeling pretty good about themselves, but then Granny comes out of the back and she goes off at them, and they kind of shrink into the corner and let her have a big chunk of the proceeds.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that even today, people are constantly doing that. Whenever anybody, even in a family setting or in interpersonal dynamics, tries to assert their worth, I'm a strong woman, or you guys never listen to me, or something, they're going to do a discharge of emotional force with a kind of muscular passion. And I think a lot of tribes used to do that. They'd have even gatherings where everybody kind of makes their case and everybody gets a sense of how intense you think you can be. And that solidifies your place, and that place determines the amount of the resources that we've captured that you get to distribute. And then you distribute down to other people relative to their place.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. And there is a lot of focus, I think, when we talk about red on sort of the stereotypical, you know, male warrior barbarian. But there were a lot of other different niches in those societies that were equally as powerful. You know, I think the perfect example that comes to mind for me is like a sorceress or a shaman or something, where, you know, comes in with his chicken bones and decides the fate of the entire group right there, and they're sort of revered for that that ability to communicate with the gods or whatever. Yeah, all of those things come into play, I think, at Red. But then comes Blue, and Blue civilizes economics just a little bit. So, and I call Blue sacrificial economics, and because the economics are blue, the way I see it is, it's about. Sorry about that. It's about the exchange of sin, essentially, and you've got clear lines of good and evil. You've got and your people are really focused on the next world in most of these societies, and when I say sin, I don't necessarily mean sin in the religious sense either. It could be sin in the sense of in the modern day, sinning against the sort of the zeitgeist of the of whatever, right? Sinning against the whatever the authority in question, says.
Would you include debt as sin in that sense?
Debt as sin. You gotta explain that one.
Well, just official use of tokens and taxation seem to be fully implemented pretty much at Blue. So that you owe something to God, you owe something to the king, you owe something to the state. And in the sense that you have to pay that off and maybe can never pay that off, then you are convicted of a perpetual sin. You owe an allegiance to the hierarchy because you can never pay off that debt. And so in a sense, that's the guilt that's upon you as a citizen. Right. Or you have a story where some, God sends himself down to pay your debt for you, the Jesus story.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
I just wonder, what's the economics of sin?
So the economics of sin is you're trading in what you're trading in is you're saying you're trying to prove to whatever your society that you are virtuous, right? So you're trading in virtue. And everything you do, if you're wealthy, for example, you'll build a church, or you'll do whatever you can to show that you're virtuous. And in the background, you may be sinning your butt off, but if you can use your power and influence to the degree that you have it, to demonstrate to the world, the outside world, that you are virtuous, that is the currency of the day. I always think of like the medieval period as sort of the atypical, right, blue or amber period, where to show their greatness, kings and emperors and so on would build these grandiose temples or churches, or in any culture you find this, and it's really just signaling to the society around them that I am a virtuous,
right,
God-fearing.
That's what they want to do with the wealth they accrue.
Right.
And then the people who've accrued a lot have some kind of relationship to the people who don't have very much, who are doing that in a small way. Like when you tithe to the church or pay your taxes to the monarch, those are holy things. The monarch is God's representative. So you are showing that you're making your donation to the holy king. So you can kind of, although a lot of taxation is just institutionalized violence to some degree, right, there is an element of paying for your sin, proving that you're virtuous by means of obeying the protocol, giving almost like you're generous. Here, I'm paying my taxes, or I'm supporting the church in the same way that I might make a pilgrimage.
Right.
If I don't have very much. If I had a lot, maybe I'll build a church. But if I don't have very much, at least I can pay my taxes the same way I can doff my cap when the Lord comes by.
Right. Or like you said, tithe or whatever. And in fact, there was a whole industry of traveling priests in the Middle Ages who would go around and sell indulgences to peasants to, absolve them of certain sins. It was just a whole, there was nothing more important, almost to the point where, it would be more important to them than feeding themselves. Is just the idea of going to the afterlife in sin was the worst of the worst, right? So anything you could do to avoid that was what was done. And so the whole economic life of these societies are sort of shaped around that.
So one of the things I didn't see very much of in your model, it's like another dimension of things, is the difference between a healthy or an unhealthy version of any of these systems. Right? It's like, is it reasonable for a person, even in the Middle Ages, to stop feeding themselves and try to give everything to the church? Is that a normal part of functional blue system? Or is that a regressive, a neurotic, a broken part of a mismanaged blue system? See, that's an additional axis that can be brought into play at each of these levels.
Yeah, I think so. And you're right. I didn't try to go into a value judgment of, what was healthy or what was unhealthy. I was kind of just trying to, pull out what the essence of these sort of the economic thoughts or the economic values of each of these stages. And so, yeah, for sure, there could be pathological manifestations of that. I'm getting a little battery here. There could be pathological manifestations of that and healthy manifestations of that, for sure. So, out of that blue stage, we get into the economics that we're all way more familiar with. So the orange modern economics, I call material economics. And this is where, we're talking about sort of the achiever self, the enlightenment comes into play. And so wealth and material comforts and so on become much more valued. And you see a more I want to say humanistic outlook, as opposed to valuing the absolving of sin. The value is placed more on material comfort and material possessions, and striving to gain those and to retain those and to pass those on. And so this is sort of the stage where everyone, I think, most people, when they think of economics, they think of this level of psychology, of value, where this is where, Green looks at this level and goes greed, right? And to an extent that's true, obviously, because what is valued at this stage is literally just the accumulation of material wealth, almost for the sake of accumulating it.
What about the principle of progress, human progress?
Right.
Is that valued there?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the accumulation of material wealth is seen as progress.
Right.
And so a person
raising the living standard in all the countries. Okay.
Right. Not only raising the living standard, not only, people at this stage will say, not only do the rich get richer, but the poor get richer. And there's truth to that. Absolutely. There's absolute truth to that. Nothing has helped the condition of the world's poor more than the wealth that is created by this stage of development. And that's not to say that there isn't bad things about that too, but, there's no doubt that the wealth created and the material comfort that we all enjoy in this day and age is largely a product of this stage.
Yeah, it's easy to see why they were so enthusiastic about it.
Right. Yeah, and it's a really it's a really optimistic stage. It's like, the world is my oyster. All I gotta do is go out there and make my mark, and so there's a real like power there, and you can see my sort of agentic bias comes out because I love like red and orange and but yeah, I mean it's very sort of inspiring that way. You got a lot of for individual action, and sort of pulling yourself up and making even the poorest person can go out and become a rich man if they just apply themselves and make the most out of what's available in the world, right?
Yeah, there's a tremendous altruism there that's easy to overlook.
Mm-hmm.
When you assimilate into yourself the more sensitive and more complex, higher level critiques, it's easy to demonize orange.
Yes.
But the amount of care, just like the amount of individuality, expands enormously at that stage. Mm-hmm. People can be humanitarian for the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people forget that it's really one of the first stages that's more transnational, more global in its outlook.
Yeah, where do you put, now I have a question here. Where would you think of an empire being? Because, like for me, like Caesar is a sort of orange or proto-orange, a transitional figure, right? Mm-hmm. That you have a traditional kind of sectarian, one race, one language, oligarchy with a rotating front man, right? You have a kingdom. And then you have a guy or a movement that says, look, we want to include more races. We want to build more roads. We want to build more aqueducts. And we're going to reach our economy out past people we consider to be Romans and really dig in with all these other people in all these other countries, which produced a lot of pushback. We now today have a kind of negative feeling about imperialism, but imperialism and internationalism are very similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It might be a blue to orange transitional stage, or it might just be one of the standard forms that orange takes.
Yeah, I think you're right there. And it may just have been orange appearing in Rome a little bit too early, right? And there wasn't enough foundation underneath that. There wasn't enough developmental blue, so to speak, as to act as a foundation for that. And it just took a little bit more time. But I agree. I think empire is part of orange. You see sort of, you think of the British Empire, all the European empires at the time, even the U.S. Empire after World War II, World War I, World War II.
I think people miss a lot of the time that empire is very often multicultural.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because blue and orange are both oligarchic in my mind. Like there is a role for the monarch in blue, but very often he's supported by the heads of the major families or something, and he can be done away with and replaced. He's to some degree a theatrical frontman among the power brokers, but all the power brokers are usually the same caste, the same race, the same language, the same religion. Mm-hmm. And orange has a very similar structure, but the ostensible presumption of orange is that you could come from any of the groups.
Right.
You could be a senator and also be a Gaul. You could be a titan of industry and also be a woman. It might not be as likely, but in principle, it's a multi-ethnic oligarchy rather than a sectarian or single ethnicity oligarchy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's preparation for green, really. It's laying the foundation for that. And these, there's a tendency in integral speak to sort of silo these things, or silo these stages, but they're really not siloed. I mean, there's gradients, right? Sure. So in a more developed orange, you would have more of that. And in a less developed orange, you'd have less. So there's sort of a spectrum there.
Yeah, you got the gradients, and then you got types, and then you have the fact that all the previous ones are still to some degree in play within each of those systems.
Right.
That makes it a very complex matter, but we got to simplify it for discussion's sake.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a shift from blue to orange that's really interesting to me, because one of the things, when I think of orange, I think in some ways its major insight is that you can capitalize on flows that are rebalancing phenomenon. We had water wheels in rivers for a long time, but at orange, people get what that is. There's a lot over here and there's not much over here. And if they're connected, it's going to flow over here. And as it does, it can do some work for me. I can skim a little off the top, right? So they build perpetual motion machines, or they, if there's a whole bunch of tulips in one place and there's not very many tulips in another place, if I can set up a mechanism to move the tulips to where they're more rare and have more value, as long as that flow is going, I can skim a little bit off every one of those transactions and accumulate my capital.
Right.
So there's this sense of a rebalancing flow. And I think that goes along with the banking system, right? You get more professionalized debt exchanges where people understand that they can profit from an endless flow. They don't really want to be paid back. They'd love for you to always be paying them back instead. Whereas at blue, there were all these prescriptions against lending, against interest, all that kind of stuff. They really didn't see that as a productive mechanism. They saw it more as an evil imposition. Whereas at orange, it suddenly becomes available to people's minds that that's a really productive mechanism, wherever you can set up a flow and then skim it.
Yeah, well, and it's even the productive part of that is the efficient use of capital. So if you and that's what interest decides, right? Interest decides where's the most efficient use for this money, right? Because if you have no interest, you have, or no system of interest, you have no way to determine where the most valuable use of that capital will be. If one person is willing to pay 5% interest and another person is willing to pay 10% interest for your capital, well, obviously the person that's willing to pay 10% interest has a more productive use for that capital. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to pay that 10% to you. So that's sort of, and those are not, those equations are not really intuitive. It's not something that a lot of people really understand right off the bat, but it's absolutely a factor, and that's what makes that's really what made orange economics so powerful.
There's a tremendous faith there. You know, in the same sense that a lot of the early stages have this tremendous psychological, what do you say, identification with support for the tribal structure. At Orange, there's this tremendous faith in the intelligence of the market. There's tremendous faith in the fact that people are rational, self-serving agents, and that what they do makes sense, and that the people who gain more are gaining more for a good reason. Right? There's a tremendous confidence in the collective mechanism.
Yeah.
Which almost sounds strange to people who grew up in the end of the 20th century or early 21st century. It's very doubtful to us, that mechanism. We have to sort of learn that confidence.
Yeah, and it's one of Green's primary criticisms of Orange is that faith, that article of faith. You know, the invisible hand that often gets brought out as sort of ha ha ha. You know, believe in that magical hand, right? But it really is. It's not. There's nothing magical about it. What it is it's understanding that the sum total of individual actions can't really be understood on a macro level, and that there's something. There's something. There really is something kind of magical about that chaos, where it all comes together. And the economy just functions without any need of someone to be pushing buttons and, you know, behind the scenes, behind the curtain. You know, all of that just gets in the way. And if we just sort of let people trade and interact, you know, then things happen.
Yes. It's tough to persuade. From Blue's point of view, that's a huge risk.
Oh yeah, yeah.
How could you possibly expect that to work?
Right, and from Green's point of view, that introduces problems of potential exploitation. And we can get into Green now. You know, from Green looks at Orange and sees, because there are problems with Orange. If you don't have perfect information, then you can't make the best, so to speak, market decisions. No one has perfect information. Some people have better information than others, and so that creates inequalities in the market. And Green is all about trying to get rid of those inequalities. You know, Green is sort of we're back to a communal stage, and so, you know, the values of Green are they're more relativistic, they're more like basically you're talking about values that are more focused on the greatest good for the greatest number, trying to get rid of sort of vast inequalities in wealth that Orange produces naturally. You know, equalize the playing field and all these sorts of laudable goals, right? And so you start to see that under Green, displays of wealth become vulgar, right? Green tends to dislike. It's funny, you know, rich people in a green society, you can hardly tell they're rich. a lot of the time, because to show that is seen as the biggest faux pas. It's just a vulgar display, right? And so, you know, the billionaire in his t-shirt and jeans and tennis shoes riding his skateboard down the street in Silicon Valley, you know, that's sort of the image of the rich now.
There's an informal ideal at Green, I think. We want to be casual, you want to be more relaxed, and you want to avoid inciting too much envy in others.
Exactly.
On the other hand, there are things that Green would accept, you know, humorous, ironic, playful demonstrations of wealth, certain kinds of benevolence, charity, play. I think they would be much more open to than traditional displays of ostentatiousness.
Right. And so wealth for Green is to be used for really for improving the lives of others, and to sort of words are escaping me, but basically how you show your wealth in a green society is that you use your wealth, and even if you're not wealthy, you're using your time and to help others and to help the community as a whole. That's where, you know, you get a lot of these NPOs and NGOs.
Sure.
People want to work for. Got a lot of young people. That's, you know, they come straight out of college and that's what they want to do, because the economics of green is, you know, how can I make the world a better place for as many people as possible? And whereas at Orange, the way you do that is by making as much money as possible and spending it out in the market. Green sees that as, you know, too self-serving. And so, you know, at Green, the economics are more about trying to use whatever power you have to better humanity.
Yeah, it seems to me that, I mean, an easy way to think about it is Green has more of a qualitative orientation. And that can be altruistic or it can be selfish to some degree. I do want other people to have a higher quality of life. That's part of what my participation in the market should do. But also, I want to have a good life. Going to work is a large part of my life, and it should be fun. It should express my character. It should be in a relaxed atmosphere. It should be in a form of money making that I can not only ethically get behind, but which I can aesthetically appreciate, which I feel resonates with who I am and as I transform. So there's all these, I want quality of life to be a fundamental feature of my participation in the marketplace. Whereas Orange might think I participate in the marketplace and the results of that are determined by me, and then that becomes my quality of life. Green wants that quality all the way along.
Right. The way I often think about it is, for Orange, making money is the game, and for Green, the playing the game is, I should say, making money is the goal of the game for Orange, and for Green, playing the game itself is the goal of the game. You know, having fun, enjoying the game is what the game is about. And so, exactly like you said, a high degree of preference for you know, jobs that are satisfying from both a, you know, ethical standpoint and just from a fun standpoint. Am I enjoying it? Am I passionate about it? Do I believe in it? You know, and companies from a corporate standpoint start to focus so much more on making sure that their employees are enjoying what they're doing, and that their employees are happy, and their employees are, and that's great. I mean, that's one of the great things about that stage is there's a much bigger focus on that. And so the idea of, you know, the typical idea of the Orange, you know, command control boss who's just, you know, shouting orders and making money and all this stuff, it starts to go away. And because employees no longer want to work for a company like that. They want to work for some place where they feel valued, where they enjoy going to, and they're having fun and all of that. And they feel like the work that they're doing is making the world a better place and not just, you know, manufacturing widgets.
There's a lot of room in there, as people constantly point out, for false versions of that to occur.
Yeah.
Right? There's green that's working, but then there's, you know, guys delivering pizzas and getting ripped off and yelled at by his boss, but still he's got to put on his resume that he's passionate about delivering pizzas. Right. And he's going to treat his boss as his buddy now, even though it's just as oppressive as it was before. There's a lot of false green out there, and I think it confuses our idea of what green is. Just like a lot of the more hysterical versions of the social justice movement are probably not examples of green. But because they use the terminology, it's hard to disentangle them from what green is.
Right.
And I think
that happens because the green is the dominant, you know, the value meme in our society. So all of the levels below green are gonna, to one degree or another, are gonna try to emulate green's sort of signals, in order to perpetuate their own value meme. So, you know, orange is not above putting on a green mask to drive sales. You know, I mean, that's totally, to them, that would be totally a pragmatic thing to do. And blue is not above taking on green with a religious zeal and promoting it, and then excommunicating all sinners and you know, and so on and so forth.
That's a tough thing to evaluate when you want all the parts of the spiral to be working together.
Yeah.
That you don't want fake versions disheartening people, but at the same time, the collaboration of the different levels has got to take the form of each of them trying to account for each other's insights and structures. Right. So for orange to be embedded with green, it's got to try to do green things in an orange way. Now that's going to be upsetting to orange because it's to green. It's inauthentic green as far as green is concerned. Mm-hmm. But from an integral perspective, or from a whole spiral perspective, that might be a good thing, even though it's upsetting to confront.
Right. It's driving things upward. Sure. Yeah. And a lot of times what's more disturbing to me is that a lot of times green can't recognize that isn't green. Like they see the signal, and then they process the signal and they go, oh, okay. Yeah. He's cool. But they don't recognize that's not actually the motivation behind, you know.
That's a bit like the health and unhealth thing. There's a superficiality and a depth thing that seems to be available at each of the phases. Right. There's another interesting thing to me about green in particular, because green seems to have this ability to shift contexts. It becomes aware of context. And it looks outside of what it thinks of as the standard little circle. So it looks outside of the hegemony towards minorities. Freud looks outside of the conscious mind to the unconscious mind. Mm-hmm. Marx does a similar thing, that there's an awareness of what was excluded before. And so there's an awareness of the potential unconscious elements and unconscious contradictions and unconscious behaviors that make up the economy. And I think that, to me, that's a lot of the reason why people got excited about Marx, was they heard an elaboration of a system of dynamics that was operating whether people realized it or not. Mm-hmm. Marx's notion of a false consciousness, or the idea, so this is interesting to me thinking about your stuff, because there's a critique at Green which says what you think you intend isn't actually what you intend. You're being manipulated by your embedment in the system. Mm-hmm. So you're voting against your interests. That's not what you intend. It's what the system intends through you that you haven't individuated from. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the postmodern take on what drives people. Right. So yeah, and you know, there is some truth to that. Of course, you know, we are in large part influenced by whatever culture we're steeped in. You know, I grew up in a certain background, and you grew up in a certain background, and that has influenced, you know, how we view the world. There's no doubt about that. So there's definitely truth to that, I think.
Yeah,
but
Green seems to be aware of like there's psychological inclinations that are created by our incentive structures that enter us unconsciously, and then we just think of them as part of our consciousness. That old, was it Upton Sinclair? It's hard to get a man to understand something if his paycheck depends upon him not understanding it.
Yep.
Green applies that very widely.
Yeah. Well, and Green suffers from it too. No doubt. But yeah, I mean, and the other thing too is, you know, with Marx, you know, Marx is sort of, to me, the epiphany of the normative economist, right? He's solidly in the what ought to be, and everything in Marxism is sort of developed off of that. And so that's, you know, that's good and bad, right? I mean, whatever, there's a part of there's always a part of the, when you're thinking about economics, there's always an ought. Everyone has an idea of what ought to be, but the problem is that it's not the same for everyone. So what I think ought to be is not the same as what, you know, you think ought to be, or what any of the other 7 billion people on the planet think ought to be, and then it's largely also, like we've been talking about, is dependent on your stage in development too, and the way you see the world. And so what ought to be for me is not the same as what ought to be for someone in, you know, a village in Afghanistan or something. Right. So Marxism, I think, has a hard time with that. Or any economic system that is solely coming out of a normative perspective will have a hard time with that. You know, even libertarianism would have a hard time with that. So when I'm thinking about integral economics, and that's a good segue into that, which I call wisdom economics, or integral economics, right? It's an economics that values multiple perspectives being held simultaneously, and allowing those multiple perspectives to sort of realize themselves in economic life. And so, you know, to me, an integral economics would be an economics that allowed all of these varied modalities that we just discussed, beige through green, to sort of coexist and function in an overall framework. And so, you know, you might have you know, communes next to tribes, next to whatever, markets and so on, and all of them sort of, there's nothing to say that one way is necessarily any better than another, but that to me, from an integral way of processing economics would just be to allow all of those things to sort of coexist and sort of play together in a functioning way. And I think only an integral level of sort of social development can allow that to happen, because otherwise what's going to happen is one of those themes, whichever one's dominant, is going to try and assert their way on all of the others.
That's a tricky one to stabilize, because the amount of force that you'd have to be able to apply has to be commensurate to the level of insight that you have, right? It's one thing to say, I've got this integral panarchy vision in which all these things can coexist, but what can I deploy to keep that system from going haywire that is somehow commensurate with the level of reality I'm trying to secure. It's a tricky one. I think securing them systems overall is a big problem for the more delicate systems. Green has this problem too, in my view.
Yeah.
Green is not terribly good at producing the economy that produces green.
Yeah.
So integral is going to face a similar problem, which is there's the economics that tends to produce people who are more integral, and then there's the economics that integral people tend to produce. And if those are the same, then that can secure itself as a new platform. But if those are not the same, you're going to run into problems, just like green does, and it can't establish the conditions that cause green to flower, and then it begins to regress.
Yeah, and I think that is a problem, and I think the quick answer to that, if I can just give a quick answer, would be,
please.
Would be you really can't have a panarchic system like that work without having the society develop to the point where it could be stable. So, today it's not going to work, right?
So what's the economics that increases the likelihood of that outcome?
Well, what you need to see is, on a global level, more orange, right? Because orange generates the wealth that allows people to be green, right?
Sure.
So you need to see that become more widespread, and we've seen that in the last 50 years. In the last 30 years, we've seen it in China. They're sort of at a blue orange kind of transition phase right now, and the more we can sort of encourage that to happen, the problem is that what green wants to do is say, no, stop, don't develop. Where you're at is just fine. What we need to do is just throw wealth at you.
I think Bryan's here.
There he is.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Where were we?
Somewhere around chartreuse, green and yellow.
Yeah. So I think what I was saying was that we were talking about sort of what would it take to manifest this panarchic integral economic stage, and I was just saying that really what it requires is that the globe just continue to develop, and that we get the majority of the globe really past orange and sort of into green, in order for that really to happen.
So to me, the green concern about that would be this, that the scale of the orange economy and the way that it can benefit from disasters are so huge that more orange might be more than the system can bear, that the ecological and inequality and pollutant outcomes of increased orange might be such that the system can't really handle that. And we might have to thwart that or change that somehow, rather than just let it unfold as it may.
Right, and of course, what green doesn't like to do is take it on an article of faith that we'll figure that out.
Right.
Right. But I think that we will. I think that we're already figuring it out. The world is a much cleaner, much nicer place than it ever has been. I know that there are a lot of people out there that don't think that way. But if you've read Steven Pinker or any of sort of his take on things and just looked at the data, things are improving exponentially for everyone.
Sounds like you're the ideological stooge of the bourgeoisie, blind to the dangers of the imminent planetary crisis.
I know. I know. But the fact of the matter is that there's that more people have food now than ever before. That even in Africa, there, I think the average caloric intake is something like 2,000 calories. So now, of course, there are places where there are famines. There's Yemen, for example, where they can't get any food, but that's because of the actions of people. That's not because of any lack of calories available for the population of the earth. And I think we'll continue to be able to do more with less. In the next decade, we're not even going to need to have animals to produce meat, and so there's just a lot out there. There's a lot there's a lot on the horizon technology-wise. From an energy perspective, I'm really stoked about nuclear. I know that a lot of, that's been it's like the boogeyman of energy, but there's just so much really great technology on the horizon that will create an abundance of energy at an extremely low cost. And for for developing countries especially, what kind of difference would it make to a village in the middle of nowhere to have their own miniature nuclear reactor? And that's what's coming up, and that's what's on the horizon are these miniaturized breeder reactors that create almost really no waste. I mean, they just keep breeding on their nuclear fuel over and over and over again until it's essentially carbon.
So you would see Orange as instrumental in generating the wealth and the information needed to implement new technologies that can stabilize us in order to allow the higher levels to emerge beyond Orange.
Right. I would see, I would see sort of the way I would see it is, integral technology. These are all integral technologies, right? Robotics, AI, biotechnologies, all of these things that are coming on board are integral. And the reason they are integral is because they require so many inputs from so many other fields that they're essentially they're essentially just unavailable to us without an integral mindset.
Well, they're integral in their production, perhaps, but once they're produced,
they can be produced by
extraordinary risk of anyone using them.
Yeah. I mean, there's the same goes for any new technology. I mean,
so how do you think we handle that? Like, is there an approach to economics that can lead to security?
No. Security. Well, security is a commodity. So you can. So if you're, it's a market good. But does economics have anything to say about security itself? I don't think so. I think that people need to figure that out. Society needs to figure that out. It's not as simple as saying, it's like the question, what do we do when we create the nuclear bomb? I mean, that was a question after World War II, right? What do we do with this now? And the problem is that as these technologies become more ubiquitous, they become easier to create, right? Easier to replicate. And will the day come when some guy in his backyard can create a nuclear bomb? It's possible, right? And what do we do about that? That's not an easy question to answer. I don't know. I don't know that, but I don't think that's necessarily
An economic question.
An economic question. Exactly.
Well, what about this in terms of bringing other values into economics? Like it might seem initially that ecology and ecological values are not necessarily part of the economy, but there's a whole school of ecological economists
Mm-hmm.
who think that if you quantify natural resources and the job that they're doing in the biosphere and
Mm-hmm.
enter that into the market calculation, it will change the prices in such a way that making money now supports finite ecological resources. And that the reason that those values are not economic values is that they're not contributing any numbers into the economy. There's different ways of getting these numbers. Like some people have argued, like why aren't Facebook likes or whatever that represents counted as some kind of currency? If that's social credit in a sense, the people are in favor of it or not. So are there ways to get numbers into the economy by other mechanisms, right? And then that the quadrants could represent zones out of which new numbers could come, that there could be ecological numbers, there could be individual interior human well-being numbers, there could be social validation numbers, if that was handled correctly. Because I think green is aware that there's these different value zones. It just doesn't stabilize them into any secure and developing structure. It knows that there's it thinks of things being valuable outside of money.
Mm-hmm.
But could money be counted in a way that included those values within it? Would that be something analogous to an integral move in terms of economy?
Well, I think that, yeah, I mean, I kind of see what you're saying. How do we quantify all of the different, I mean, we just went through and we talked about all the different stages and how they perceive value. And all of those values could be set up in a similar way to like the GDP, right? Where you say, okay, what is the GDP of happiness? What's the country that does that? Is that
Bhutan or something
Bhutan,
like that?
thank you. Yes. So they have a measurement, right? Where they say, we don't care about economic GDP. We care about the happiness GDP, right? And yeah, you could do that for any set of or any economic set of values. And I think that's just as legitimate a measuring stick as any other. My own value sort of paradigm is a mix of a lot of things, and material wealth is just a small portion of the overall picture of what I value in my life, and I think most people are like that. So yeah, I mean, economics to me is more than just counting pennies and counting productivity and all that kind of stuff. It's really about studying human transactions.
It seems like there's an opportunity. Now, maybe it's completely far-fetched, some kind of science fiction scenario that I'm putting forward here, but if people believed, for some good reason, that when they made $1, that was increasing the well-being of the material resources on the planet, was making people happier, was improving the well-being of the group, in addition to negotiating properly in the market.
Mm-hmm.
Like if all of that was represented by the making of the numbers, the making of the quantities, if $1 represented something from all of those zones, then people would be much happier with the economy. That the argument that Orange puts forward, which is it's good to get out there and compete and make money in that market.
Right.
Green might be able to get on board. Blue might be able to get on board. They might be more able to be convinced of Orange's argument if the structure of the numbers was anchored in multiple value fields, right? That might be something, and then maybe it's very science fiction, but it might be something that an integral type of insight could bring in that would allow at the very least, green and orange to work better together. Because if green really thought every time it earned $1, all these areas like ecology were being benefited, their resistance to the orange mechanism would drop considerably. It would start to assume that that mechanism was what orange said it was, a means of improving human well-being across multiple domains.
Yeah. I mean, I see it as more of, I think it would be, I don't know how you would, I don't really know how you would do that. But I see it as more of like, what the function of orange is to satisfy demand, right?
Okay.
Satisfy consumer demand. So as our demands get more developed, orange naturally just satisfies those. So if we have low developmental demands, I just want the cheapest, X of whatever, and
right.
I don't care how you manufacture it, right? I don't care what pesticides you put in my food, whatever makes it cheaper, I just want it, right? That's a sort of a low developmental level of consumption. And so orange will gladly provide that. On the other hand, if my values dictate that, I want organic food, I want the most stringent testing procedures to be put on that, I want safe products, I want products that are produced responsibly. If that is what the market is demanding, orange will naturally cater to that as well. So I think the answer is not necessarily, unnaturally forcing orange to be something that's not, but rather just playing to the strengths of orange and demanding of it the products or services or whatever it is that we want at a higher level of development. So and I think that's just naturally happens.
That's a more moderate position. My scenario was a bit sci-fi, I think. But there is something there that I think we often think about the economy taking a leap in terms of the technology we use to process the units of currency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's Bitcoin, right? Or green is very fond of, as it should be, electronically mediated transactions, electronic credits, as opposed to abstract paper credits, as opposed to, metal credits back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
But that's only from, say, one zone. When you look at how are we actually processing the numbers, another question is, where are we getting the numbers from? What would be a similar leap, right? If we took that leap to blockchain verification, what would be a similar leap in where we get our numbers from? So there's that. I don't know the answer. I just think it's an interesting option.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying there, and I think the possibilities are endless, really. I mean, I could imagine all kinds of different currencies that are generated and based on all kinds of different things. You have something that comes to mind is a website called Skillshare. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I've seen some ads.
Yeah. So, and I don't know anything about it actually, but the idea that comes to mind when I think of something like that is, I've got this skill or I've got this talent and I'm going to put it out there and sorry, I keep falling down here. And someone else may have another skill and we match up and we just trade, right? And no currency is changing hands. It's just, hey, I know how to make beehives and you know how to play the piano, and I'll take your piano lessons and I'll make you a beehive, and that's how we trade. Or, I can imagine many variations on things like that.
Yeah.
And the problem is that all of those become stifled under sort of the current under the current system of a regulated economy and all these things. And how do you tax my beehives that I've just given to this guy for the transaction of getting piano lessons? How do you regulate that? What, does he have a license to do that? You know, and you get into all of these things that are part of sort of leftover vestiges of amber and orange,
Right.
blue and orange, that just will more and more have no place. So yeah, I mean, and we just got a message there from Bruce. What about the Chinese social credit experiment, right? Do you want to take that one?
Well, I think it's potentially the beginning of something really interesting, right? I don't trust the Chinese government necessarily, but the idea of social credit has a long history, and I think it has a lot of benevolent and complex mutations that it could take the form of in the future.
Right.
I think that citizen wealth should be counted somehow, because I think on the one hand, there's a very poetic thing about a lot of stuff that's important to me falls outside of the economy, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, there's a lack of security there, as if the system is going to move on like a juggernaut and the things I care about are going to get screwed because they're not counted in the economy.
Right.
Right. And maybe being a good citizen is something that should be counted. Maybe having the right number of trees to sustain the atmosphere of the planet is something that should be counted.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know. That's a negotiable phenomenon. So I respect them as an experiment. I would like to see what happens. I don't necessarily agree with what they're going to be using as the parameters, but I think everybody's going to have to try some kind of experiment like that, especially in a hyper-surveilled, hyperlinked information economy globally.
Yeah.
We're going to have to figure out ways to register our values in different contexts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I think it's very, very interesting. And I also am scared shitless for what the Chinese people are going to be put through. But it's not new. When I think of social credit systems, I think of things like if you ever used eBay, every transaction you make, you're judged on, right? And that's a form of social credit.
That's an interesting way of enfolding other levels of the economy that we've been talking about, because it's very similar to that red status economy.
Yeah.
You get voted up by your peers.
Right. Reddit has a similar structure where you get upvotes and so on, and Facebook and all of these things. They have the thing about those, though, is that they're organic and they're voluntary, right?
Yeah.
And when you start doing a top-down social credit system like the Chinese are doing, I think what you'll find is it's just going to be a horrible, horrible mess.
Right. It's not going to have the complex intelligence of an actual market.
No. And it's going to be used in a way that just supports the regime. I mean, it's not. There's no benefit to it for anyone else but the Chinese government. So
it's interesting to think about what would have to be done to social credit in order to make it function more intelligently like a market. Like sometimes I've heard people say, like I mentioned before, why don't Facebook likes count as a kind of currency that I can use? But in order for them to do that, they would have to go up and down. You would have to be able to get likes and dislikes, and there would have to be a limited number of them so that it becomes transactional. If you have an unlimited number of only positive things, you can't make an economy operate that way.
Right. I could imagine a sort of aggregator, right, that takes all of your Facebook likes and takes all of your eBay credit and takes all of your Reddit upvotes and everything, sort of all of the social currency that we generate in our lives, maybe even your financial credit, whatever, takes all of that and aggregates it maybe, and that's your social credit score. I mean, I think there's definitely something to that, and you could even have any transaction, any day-to-day transaction, you know, your Uber driver gives you 5 stars or whatever, right? And you know, you can just imagine this going on and
Sure.
on and on. And in a society, a panarchic society, where there's really no, you know, there's no overarching sort of, you know, government that's like, you know, setting all the rules, for lack of a better word. It would be really useful to be able to say, you know, I don't know you, let me look up your social credit. Oh, okay, you know, you got a good score, that means you're generally a trustworthy person and I can deal with you now, right? You know, I could definitely see that, that being a part of the mix.
Yeah. There's another thing that comes up for me a lot when I consider economics, and that's, when I consider a lot of things, the procedures for group intelligence and how people make decisions together and organize what they're going to do. There's a lot of things that get examined as economics seem to me based on procedures. Like, arguably, one of the things Marx was saying is that if you have a handful of I'm just going to hold this position until something happens.
All right, I'm back.
There we go.
Man, I'm having problems here.
Well, we should be just about done.
Okay.
I was just going to mention this thing about the way people organize themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And one way of interpreting a Marxist critique is the idea that if you have a handful of owners or a handful of major shareholders, and they make the decisions about what everybody else is going to do and about where the resources are going to go when they make profits off that work, then of course those people are going to benefit themselves at the expense of all the people who are doing the work.
Right.
And conversely, if you set up a communist system and replace the major shareholders with state administrators, you get the exact same situation. You get a handful of people who have to make the decisions for everyone else's labor and for the results of everyone else's labor. They're obviously going to benefit themselves. There's no feedback loop that would require them to benefit those people. So what you have is a kind of decision-making system. If we imagine that group of people, 4 or 5 of them are making the decisions for all the rest. It's very limited in terms of the amount of intelligence that's going to get filtered into the decision. So you could say that the critique is of not class struggle, but of a particular limited form of group decision-making process.
Right.
In the same way that democracy is a better group decision-making process, and you could get even better ones down the road. So what's, on the one hand, integral economy is just an economy that takes this whole developmental multi-quadrant vision into account somehow. But on the other hand, integral economics could be, how do we make decisions about what we're going to do and decisions about what we're going to do with our wealth that is at a level similar to that vision? What's a group decision-making protocol that's analogous to the complexity of that vision? How can we make decisions together that support that? Because if we make decisions together in the wrong way, it's possible that regardless of our individual visions, we might regress to the level of economy that is appropriate to that mode of group decision-making.
Right. Yeah, I guess my take on that is that, you know, at integral, the we becomes extremely large, right? Almost so large that it's hard to even fathom. And so you can't, I don't really think that at that level, you really want to have big decisions being made that would affect the smaller levels. Like I kind of imagine it, you know, you have your family, you have you as an individual, right? An individual whole life. You have your family, You have your immediate neighborhood, your community, your city, your state, your nation, and then the world. Well, you don't want the world deciding what's going to happen at the community level.
Right.
You don't even want the nation to decide what's going to happen at the community level. So I think that as you increase in complexity, the decisions that are made at that level have to be way higher, sort of general, right? You don't want the global, whatever it's going to be, the global level of organization deciding what the community is going to, how the community is going to distribute their food. So, and that's the problem that you had with communism, I think, in the 20th century, was that you had these enormously complex systems governed at a level that was just where the inputs they were getting did not allow them to make the proper decisions for communities, right? So I think that the way an integral panarchy would work is that you would have, all of these different communities that would have all of their different value systems, and they would be trading and interacting with each other, and maybe they decide on a community level how they want to be represented at the next higher level, right? So maybe a red community just sends their chief, right? And the green community decides by consensus who is the best person to represent them, and so on. But the decisions that are made at those higher levels are necessarily smaller in scope than the decisions that are made at the local levels.
What do you do about local situations that seem morally abhorrent to the higher levels? Do you permit those or not permit those?
I think you have to permit them up to the point where so I'll give you an example.
Okay.
Let's say slavery. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You have a community in your panarchy that is enslaving their neighbors. Okay. Now, obviously that's a problem because the people who are being enslaved are not choosing to be part of that community. They're being abducted against their own will. So I think at the point where we're violating the free choice and the free association of other people, then that's the point where, the higher level has to sort of step in and go, whoa, not cool, guys. If you want to be a part of this global community and partake in all of the richness that we can offer you, you have to refrain from that behavior. And if you don't return those people, then there will be consequences. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. So
one of the things that would interest me or concern me a lot is how those higher levels, let's say even an integral administrative level that's overseeing a panarchy of some kind, how do they make their decisions, right? They're not representing themselves in a chief, right? Do they think that a simple majority vote is an adequate or inadequate form of decision making for that level? Or what form of group decision making is appropriate to that scale, that you can have confidence is compiling the actual multidimensional input from all the different players politically and economically? Because I think one of the problems we face with democracy at the moment is that a lot of people feel like it is not compiling the intelligence for most of the people who are participating.
Right.
No, it is technically a democracy, right? We have a show of hands majority vote. But if the majority vote is 51-49, then virtually half of the input is left out of the conclusion every time. So that's substandard, in a way.
Yeah. It's almost a tragedy, really, for the other 49%.
Yeah.
And that's why, you know, when I think of, you kind of said it like an administrative body or whatever, a higher level, you know, I don't think of it as a monolithic thing, right? Like there's not just one.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a few, and you know, like almost like I'm choosing which insurance company I'm gonna hire, you know, to cover me, to protect me, and to represent me to the larger world whenever I have a problem. And
so the competition of methodologies.
Exactly. And so I wouldn't, and you know, and if it's structured in that way, then you might choose the one, depending on your outlook, you might choose the one that gives you the most protection. You might choose the one that leaves you alone the most. You might choose the one that that has the best reputation and gives you the ability to interact with more communities outside. You know, there's all kinds of different. I like to say I'm not you know, I don't have all the answers for that stuff like that, but I would think that that when we get to that stage, when these systems are being implemented, I don't want to see it being done in a way where you know, a group of really smart guys all get together and they say, like they did at the Constitutional Convention in the U.S., and they say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we write up a constitution, and boom, that's how it's done. I would much rather much rather be sort of organically developed and see a lot of different methodologies being tried, and over time that will generate the sort of the optimal solution.
So it's an opt-in multi-economic framework of some kind.
Right. Yeah. And how that, you know, a lot of people get overly sort of concerned about, well, how does justice work, and how do we resolve disputes, and what about war, and all of these things, and if you just take a moment to sort of step out of the conventional box of, you know, the nation state ideal that we all have, because that's the world we live in, and you think about how incredibly, I don't know if balkanized is the right word, but just like how incredibly diverse and dispersed all of these communities would be, and when they're interacting with each other. I mean, imagine a war between if you imagine the devastation of a war between two nations. In a panarchy, it would be a war between, you know, this city block and that city block, you know, and yeah, that's destructive maybe, but it's not like World War II destructive, right? And hopefully those sorts of things are resolved in a more peaceful manner. And I think that would be the case, because in our day-to-day reactions, or our day-to-day interactions with each other, right, we don't have officials of the state standing over us all the time saying, okay, pay your grocery bill now, okay,
right. Most of it's internalized.
Right. Most of it is we're obeying the rules of society because we recognize that there's an advantage for us to do so. And I think that would play out on a larger level in a panarchy society.
The number one reason I haven't killed the mayor of my town is that I don't want to.
Right.
So that's in reality, that's a first line of military defense, is that most people don't want to do those things.
Well, and it's cost prohibitive too. Like if you had to bear the cost yourself, and if you imagine yourself in a community of people in a panarchy society, you had to bear the cost of hacking and overcoming the defenses of a neighboring community for whatever reason, it suddenly becomes much more costly to you.
So that's an interesting feature, because I think that a lot of the rich organic complexity that could be in socioeconomic systems is currently not in those systems because we lack the feedback mechanisms that would naturally organize those things.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways to think of, if the people who make the decisions are not affected by the consequences of their decisions, Nassim Taleb's skin in the game kind of stuff,
Right.
then the emergent organic system doesn't really self-regulate if the decision makers can insulate themselves from the consequences of their decisions.
Right.
Then the question becomes, how do you oversee that? And oversee is maybe the wrong metaphor, but there has to be a system of exchange. There has to be some interoperability between all these different regions, these different economies. There has to be some way to ensure that you're getting reasonably viable versions of each economy, and they're not creating things that are going to get out of control. Like if I attack the next block, and I attack them with a virulent new virus, and it's going to take out half the planet, somebody has to be watching that to some degree. And economically, there has to be a way for these different zones to trade with each other, to have interoperable currency, have some kind of stability. So where does that all come from? That, as ephemeral as we hope it is, that superstructure, how do we get that?
I think it, I actually wrote, how do we get there? Kind of the topic of one of the essays I wrote a long, long time ago.
You're way ahead of me on this.
And I think how we get there is that it will just naturally happen. I mean, as silly as that is to say, I really do think that, as the center of gravity of our societies goes from orange to green to integral finally, it will just sort of be natural. And what we'll see is that, technology and all of the things that are developing will make these central command and control state apparatuses obsolete. They just won't be necessary, and people won't use them, and people won't want to rely on them. There'll be more efficient means to serve those ends. And we're already starting to see this. We see it in education. We see it in justice with arbitration. I mean, I have a business, and you better believe I don't want to go to court for anything. All of my contracts say, let's go to mediation and arbitration first. Well, that's private justice right there. So I'm not utilizing the justice system because it's way more expensive for me to do that than it is to solve my disputes in a different way. So the evolution of that over time is just going to be, I think, exponential. And you'll see that eventually the state becomes more and more it's just this obsolete thing that, and it becomes weaker and weaker because people are, what you'll start to see is that people just stop voting.
Right.
So try to imagine, the election of 2030, and 25% of the population voted, right? The voting age population voted. Well, how legitimate is that government? And so there'll just be this sort of natural progression, I think.
True. There's a lot of darkness and chaos possible for a long time as that transition goes on.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Right. You can imagine hundreds of years of situations in which the people who get elected represent almost no one, and everyone feels completely dispirited and confused.
Right. Well, and it can go, and see, that's the thing with these transitions, these big transitions between phases, is that they can, by and large, they don't happen in a very nice way. There's a lot of turmoil that goes with it.
This is a funny paradox in talking to you, because on the one hand, you seem very faithful, very optimistic.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, with the same optimistic tone, you're like, could be terrible, might be awful.
Well, no, not even.
It's going to be extremely messy. Everyone's going to die, but I think it's going to work out.
Well, but there's something to that, though, right? I mean, you know, every progression has been a painful, you know, growing experience, and I don't think this one will be any different. I predict that, you know, there's going to be some hell to pay to get to this next paradigm.
Well, we're trying to figure out what we can do to make it as smooth as possible.
Well, that's what I've been writing about.
Good. I'd like, in your work, I'd like to hear your take on what distinguishes healthier from less healthy versions of each of these different economies. That would be a neat thing. However long, you know, just for you to think about, because I'd love to hear your take on it, like in a year.
Okay. Yeah.
Otherwise, I think we've probably talked a lot. That's great. Thanks for taking us through your stages and your model.
Yeah, it was awesome to talk to you.
Maybe Bruce wants to pop back in and give us a pat on the head or something.
Yeah, he's figuring out the technology there. We didn't lose him, did we?
No, I'm here.
There. Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
We didn't put you to sleep, did we?
Oh, I just lifted my head off the table and wiped my drool. That's why I've got the camera off here. Actually, I really enjoyed it. I appreciated getting a closer look at Bryan's model. And Layman, as usual, you were a skillful interlocutor. I'm hopeful the integral stage can provide a platform for showcasing the thinking and grassroots work of more of our community members. You know, material that doesn't get a lot of exposure on the mainstream outlets, but which I think really deserves more attention and discussion.
Like Bryan, there's a lot of people who have a good take of their own on a lot of these themes and are putting a lot of thought and energy and sensitivity and intelligence into these things. And the other people in the community don't necessarily get to experience the richness of that. They might hear it referenced, but not everybody's going to read things. Not everybody's going to get in on every conversation.
Right.
To have a situation where somebody can come forward and show part of their take, I think that's really valuable, especially in an interactive setting, so that people can also look at it and see, oh, maybe there is really a community of some kind. People are talking to each other, not just outputting their new book at the end.
Yeah, it's a great project.
Well, I doff my 19th century cap to the both of you.
All right.
Great.
All right.
I will take care.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.